Welcome to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda, and that's it.
Right? That's unusual for us, but we do have a little bit of a different program today that is going to focus on our responsibility as citizens to participate to the best of our ability in the political life of our community, which includes voting. So we will be discussing what the Catechism has to say about that, as well as the USCCB and some others of the teachings from in our Catholic faith. So one thing is today, as this is released, this should be October 5th, and tonight is going to be the Eucharistic rally at the Cajun Dome at 6 p.m. I'm going to be there and looking forward to seeing a lot of y'all out there. It's going to be an amazing thing and a very important mission for everybody to understand the real presence of Jesus. And I wanted to point out that to prepare for this, I was reading, because Jeff is more prepared, y'all. One thing you may not know, I think in one of our last shows, Jeff said in his former life, he said a prayer, the prayer of humility, and that life really wasn't a former life like reincarnation, but it was,
felt like it maybe.
But it was another time in a galaxy far, far away in the Midwest when he was a state senator in Indiana, and so we were very involved in politics at the time.
I couldn't have done it if I didn't have you and the family to support me during that time. And we viewed it as a calling. And in a lot of ways, that's the way we need to be viewing our engagement as a calling and as a directive from our Lord. And actually, we'll talk a little bit more about that.
And the reason why, I think it's really interesting that the Eucharistic rally is tonight in the Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, which is a call to political responsibility from the Catholic bishops of the United States. Within that document, there's a message from Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict XVI, in his reflection on the Eucharist as the sacrament of charity, challenged all of us to adopt what he calls a Eucharistic form of life. And this means that the redeeming love we encounter in the Eucharist should shape our thoughts, our words, and our decisions, including those that pertain to the social order. The Holy Father calls for Eucharistic consistency on the part of every member of the Church, which I just think is really cool. That is going out today. And part of the reason we want to get this out today is an election that's coming up.
Yeah, as most of you hopefully know, we have an election coming up on October 14th, which is, as we know here in Louisiana, it's called the primary. For those of you who are really engaged, it's called a jungle primary because anyone can vote no matter what party you are or no party or anything. As long as you are registered, you can go ahead and vote for whomever is on the ballot. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that a little bit later on who's going to be on the ballot and why it's so important. But one thing that I think everyone needs to understand, and this is where, if you're listening and you reach out and got your catechism nearby, reach out and get it. And it was kind of interesting because I remember when we were back in Indiana, I think it was one of our pastors who said that if you don't go and vote in this election, I expect to see you in the confessional.
Wow. And
I said, wow, he must have just made that up. He just wants people to go and vote. Well, it's interesting that if you turn to paragraph 2240 in the Catechism, it states that we have a moral obligation to exercise the right to vote. So that is a huge responsibility. And I know there's a lot of folks out there that will go and vote, and they're like, well, I don't know who's on the ballot or what's on the ballot and whatnot. And we'll give some resources here at the end. But you have to keep in mind what, I think this was back in 1998, there was a document put out by the American bishops called Living the Gospel of Life. And they said when American political life becomes an experiment on the people rather than for and by them, it will no longer be worth conducting. And so I think maybe as we look at what's happening in our society right now, that it may be a wake-up call, that we really need to become and more engaged. Because as Jesus, said, we will be judged by our actions. And the flip side of that is also, we will be judged by our non-actions. So, it's critical that every Catholic know that, without exception, that we are called by our Lord to proclaim his message, and that is also in political engagement and activity. Whether we are on the school board, whether we're running for president, whether we are running for town council, or whether we're voting. And this is why we're bringing you this program today, to just get a clarification on where the church stands and why it does.
If you've been listening to Father Mike Schmitz, you've also been hearing this call to participate in social life. That's been the message that he's been reading from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Is an entire section, and Jeff had mentioned another section. There's several sections in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that address this. So we're strongly urging people to go look at what the church has to say in its timeless teachings on these things.
You mentioned timeliness, and I think that's what's a wonderful part of the church, is that when the church declares something, then it is going to be timely 100 years ago or 100 years from now. Back in 1998, when they wrote this one document, Living the Gospel of Life, they mentioned virtual reality and genetic science may give us an illusion of power, but we are not gods. And that's something for us to always remember. I mean, in today's society, heck, we're talking about transhumanism. We're talking about all these aspects of science, which, of course, science, faith and science go together. However, they need to be put in the right perspective, in that, we cannot cross that line which violates human dignity. And that's something that I think we have to get a better understanding about. And when it does, then, it's incumbent upon, quite frankly, the church to take to task people who go across that line. And even in politics, where it talks about that, and to pass moral judgment even in matters regarding to politics, whenever the fundamental rights of man or salvation of souls require it, that the church, in its moral obligation to save souls, will take us to task when we cross that line. The goal is not to get across that line. And that's why engagement in politics, engagement in our civil life is so important.
Yeah, we've talked about timelessness of many of the documents, but this is, they refer back to these even in the most recent, which the one I'm referring to, the Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, is one of the most recent documents put out, but they still are referencing timeless thoughts and principles in this document. And when they are discussing how to form your conscience for this, it says foremost among the teachings are 4 basic principles of Catholic social doctrine. Number 1, not surprisingly, is the dignity of the human person. Number 2 is the common good. Number 3, subsidiarity, which might be a little bit more confusing and something that I had to look more into. And number 4 is solidarity. And I think that we can break down some of these principles and start talking about some of the policies that fall under them. Number 1 is going to be, or I think the one most obvious, which is the dignity of the human person.
That's right. And of course, first and foremost is realizing that the value of human life. And the church has always proclaimed that, we protect human life from the very beginning to the very end. And that's something that, some of us, may have struggled with at certain points, or maybe still might be struggling on that, whether it's abortion, whether it's euthanasia, whether it's the death penalty. The one unique thing is that we all know that we have this dignity, and God gave it to us in our life, and only God can take it away. And so, when we are thinking about the various aspects of human dignity, and yes, that also includes the right to a fair wage, that includes the health care and all of that. However, before we get to those aspects of life, it has to go from the very beginning. If you do not have life, if you are not given the chance to life, then you have no opportunity to engage in the other aspects of our civil system.
The second principle that they go into is the common good. And I'd like to read the definition. It's one that Father Mike did emphasize in his talks, and I think it is a very concise and good definition. In the Catechism, it says that the common good is to be understood as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So supporting that dignity of each person is basically what the common good, they go hand in hand with each other.
And an example of that is a right to gather together. I mean, our laws that we have allows for peaceful gatherings, allows for protests, and without having those freedoms, we would be in, we might have another form of government. And, the church even acknowledges that democracy is the best expression of the direct participation of citizens. I love history, so I go back. At one time, I knew that the church condemned communism. And so I had to look back. And for, I would say, probably 150 years, the church has condemned. The most recent document was in 1949, when Pope Pius XII, said, those who declare themselves communists excommunicate themselves from the church. And so that was, once again, that was at a very critical time in our history, 1949. And then people always say, well, what about socialism? Well, Pope John Paul the Great condemned socialism time and time again in speeches. And of course, he wrote a document in 1992 condemning and rejecting socialism. And of course, we need to understand Pope John Paul II, when he was young, he saw oppression by certain governments and saw it firsthand and realized that these governments, socialism, communism, violate the dignity of the human person. And while no form of government is perfect, the church does acknowledge that democracy is the best expression.
I'm glad you had mentioned peace too, because that peace, that is the stability and security of a just order. This is what the Catechism has to say about the final piece of that puzzle, the need for peace within and order within for the common good of all.
And we see in many parts of our world today, there is no peace. Obviously, we see what's happening in Ukraine, and the church has been very adamant that they never take sides in a lot of these conflicts, but they are always behind the scenes working to try and resolve and find peace among nations. And that's, historically has been the role of the church, to be the moderator, to be the example of peace. And, not only in the Ukraine, but we see certain parts of the world, especially actually in countries where Catholicism and vocations are thriving, such as Nigeria, a very oppressive government. You see priests and seminarians and religious disappearing, being murdered almost every week. But the church is thriving. The vocations are thriving. And so we need to constantly pray for peace in the world.
So we're going to go to that third principle that helps to form our conscience in the political area and social participation, and it's called subsidiarity. This one I found really interesting when it was explained, and Father Mike also explained this, but it's basically the idea that the most local aspect of the person, themselves being their own dignity, and then their families, and then their local schools, and then their local governments. These are the people that need to be administering the needs of those people. The higher authorities should not be oppressive to those lower that are closer and more personal in that area. I'm trying to explain it the way I understand it, but does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense. And then the last one is, and then the world. But before you get to that point, you have to take care of home first.
Well, this is where it states in the letter that the family is based on a marriage between a man and a woman, is the first and fundamental unit of society, and is a sanctuary for the creation of nurturing of children. And it should be strengthened and not undermined or further distorted. Respect for the family should be reflected in every policy program. It's important to uphold parents' rights and responsibilities to care for their children including the right to choose their children's education. So this is the type of thing where the church actually steps in a document like this and says, families need to have a right to make decisions for themselves, and also children should each have a right to grow up in a home with a mother and father.
And that's right. And in every document that we are looking through here today, and almost every document you'll find that relates to this issue, the church has always stood very firm on the marriage between one man and one woman. And we see in our society today that the culture is trying to tear that down, because I think they realize that if they can tear down the family, they can tear down our society, because the family is so extremely important. And they realize, well, if you can tear down the family, then we can do just about anything. And that's what we're seeing. And I know that in our society, those of us who want to stand for marriage of one woman, one man, where we want to stand for the protection of the family, quite frankly, we're becoming a minority, and we need to stand up, and we need to be either vocal or quiet with our feet and with our vote. But this is where we begin to get into the nitty-gritty of looking at holding our elected officials' feet to the fire on these issues. Because if we have elected folks who don't believe what we believe in, then we definitely have even a greater moral responsibility to become more and more engaged.
And just to wrap up subsidiarity, in case you missed my gobbledygook there, this document says it nicely. The principle of subsidiarity reminds us that the larger institutions in society should not overwhelm or interfere with smaller or local institutions. So I just feel like that's an important thing, as we've seen some issues with that, in the past, and hopefully we won't have more of that in the future.
Well, we've had recent issues with regard to the federal government and interjecting a certain undue authority on certain groups, and of course that is absolutely not acceptable, and that's why we need to be engaged. Before I go on, I'll just remind people that you are listening to Catholic Radio for Acadiana, 99.5 FM and 90.5 FM. We are your local lay Dominicans, Third Order Dominicans, based out of Our Lady of Wisdom Church in Lafayette, Louisiana. And this is our apostolate. Our apostolate is to come to you and bring the fruits of our contemplation to you for discussion, for engagement, for your contemplation as well. So we want to thank Stein Lumber for their sponsorship that allows us to bring our thoughts to you. So, for many years, there have been a lot of politicians on all sides of the aisle that have always said, I'm personally opposed to certain things, but I don't think I can force my religious views on anyone else.
I grew up with that.
Yes.
That
and,
comment, yeah.
and that was big in the 80s, 90s, maybe still big today. It all depends. But we heard that a lot. And the bishops were very, very clear that, for those who follow this worldview, they are seriously mistaken. And this is taken from the Gospel of Life, paragraph number 23. And it's so important that, because they give a good example in terms of how odd would it be if someone said, well, I'm personally opposed to slavery or racism or sexism, but I can't force my personal view on the rest of society. I mean, that's the example that the bishops use.
Right.
And how odd and shocking that sounds. But we still today have elected officials who will say that. And I'm talking about Catholic elected officials who will say that. And those are the ones we have to pray for the most.
Well, and just to qualify, one thing you said a little while ago when you just mentioned that there are Catholic politicians who actually don't follow through with what their faith is in their public life. And I think you mentioned earlier that in some of this, they're excommunicating themselves, right? You said, I think you made the statement, the church doesn't excommunicate them, they excommunicate themselves, especially when it's directly opposed to some of the highest fundamental dogma of our church.
Absolutely. And, once again, the point of clarification and disclaimer, we're not here to judge anyone. The important thing is we're here to tell the truth. And we are just reiterating what the church teaches. And, especially in these issues, which are extremely, extremely important. Because, we talk about where faith and science meet. Well, faith and politics meet right in the voting booth. And that is why the church was so adamant in saying that we have a moral obligation to not only vote, but to be engaged in some level in our society. And, that's whether that's running for office, working within a political party, contributing. These are all options that the document Faithful Citizenship called a Catholic call to political responsibility. I think this was 2003. But they give the examples of running for office, working in a campaign, giving money to a campaign, and that's engagement. And I know some people think, well, I might only have one vote, or I might not make a difference. But I can tell you, and Cheryl can tell you as well, that when I ran for state senator, I was running against a 22-year incumbent. And everything was against us in terms of money and quote unquote power and so on and so forth. But we won. We won by 213 votes, and
every vote counted.
And every vote counted. And I tell you what, we were going door to door. And the thing is, we didn't do it ourselves. We had tons of people working with us. And a lot of them were Catholics, and they wanted to see change. They wanted to see, positive impact into society, into politics. And I'll never forget. The most powerful type of person to go door to door or stand outside a precinct passing out a flyer is a pregnant mom, because no one can say no. At that point, and if you do, she'll tell you why you're wrong, and that's the only reason why we won, I'm sure, because and during that time, it was the goal of to implement Catholic social teaching and everything, and the votes that I took, there were, I never had a difficult vote, but there were lots of votes taking place in the legislature. One made it more easy to get divorce. I think it was called no-fault divorce at the time. And I think I was one of the only people to vote against it. And it's these type of things that we can't just go along with society and say it's okay. We have to stand up and take action.
So the very last of the 4 principles that were brought up in the Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship is solidarity. So I just wanted to touch on this before we move on to any of the other documents or thoughts on our involvement in community life. And solidarity is basically includes a lot of our social justice principles, but being united together to help our brothers and sisters around us, to have a heart for those around us through charitable acts and support. So I think those are more self-explanatory. But as far as policies go, we definitely want to support our brothers and sisters, especially in their dignity of life, the most helpless ones.
And we can see that every day with people on the street. If you go and work at the St. Joseph Diner, you can see that every single day, every single meal, there are needs in our community. And once again, it starts at home with the needs of the family, and then it outreaches toward the needs of the community. And so we need to be engaged first and foremost at home with the family, and then looking at our community locally, what needs to be addressed. And then, of course, on a statewide level, we look at that. and then expand on that. So at this point, I always like to say, okay, what's the takeaway? What can people do? So I'm going to give you action items on what to do. So first of all, if you don't know who your state senator or state representative is, that's going to be your homework for this week. And some of you say, well, how do I do that? Well, I'm going to tell you how to do that. So you go to the Louisiana State Legislature website. And on there, it's www.legis.la.gov, or just do a search. And you will go to their website. And at the very top left, it says, who are my legislators? You click on that, and you put your address in, and it will list who your state senator is, your state representative is, who your congressperson is, and then the 2 U.S. senators. And then more specifically, with the election we have coming up this next weekend, the primary is October 14th. And I think we need to be very cognizant of what's on the ballot. And I know it's shocking to some, but we have 16 people running for governor. Did you know that?
No.
I did not know that either until I printed off this sample ballot. So we have 16 people running for governor, 6 people running for lieutenant governor, 8 for secretary of state, and we have 5 for attorney general. We're not going to go into any of these, but it's just a wake-up call to, you need to get the sample ballot. And where do you get it at? You go to the Secretary of the State of Louisiana. You click on voter information, and over the top left, it says review sample ballot. And then you can review your sample ballot that you will see, the same ballot that you'll see on Election Day. One thing I do want to mention, that there are constitutional amendments. And some of them I know can be very hard to understand and not very important to the average person. However, I will say that Constitutional Amendment number 2 is on the ballot, and it's whether we vote yes or no on providing that the freedom of worship is a fundamental right worthy of the highest protection. So I'll say that again. Provides for the freedom of worship is a fundamental right worthy of the highest protection. That is on our constitutional, that's on our ballot for amending the Constitution. So obviously, hopefully, everyone listening, that's a big yes.
Yes. So get out and vote for that one. And probably did you have any other agenda items? I have one that I really want people to go find this document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. The USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, put this out in 2015. And they're in part 2, there's applying Catholic teaching to major issues, a summary of policy positions of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is very, very important section. I would recommend people look at this, and it covers so many different things: human life, promoting peace, marriage and family, religious freedom. Just like Jeff was mentioning, that is on the ballot now. These are pertinent to what is currently you can go vote for next week.
That's right. And a plug for not only what you can do before you go and vote. We have a Rotary Rally coming up on October 14th at the parking lot of St. Patrick Church on Pinhook here in Lafayette. Please join us for the Rotary Rally, and then we can go vote.
We'll see you next week on Studium to Studio. And remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. My soul's alright, but my body